This lecture will turn to the latter Middle Ages and look at art in Italy and Germany before the Renaissance. The first city we will begin with urban monasticism and the rise of the Franciscans, begins in the city of Assisi, just northeast of Orvieto in the Papal States. At Assisi, we find a new mendicant or begging order, one dedicated to the urban poor, is going to find the Franciscans being founded, approved by the Pope in 1209 to 10. Now, St. Francis of Assisi is going to be today the head saint and the most popular protector of Italy, and of course the world over is one of the most popular saints. He is canonized in 1228. The son of a wealthy merchant, we know that by tradition he gives away all of his earthly possessions and devotes his life to the urban poor. Hence, he founds a mendicant order. What is interesting about the founding of the Franciscans and other mendicant orders like the Dominicans is that they represent, by their very foundation, the economic expansion that we see in the 1200s, which saw the growth of an urban poor. You cannot have urban poor without an urban population. Hence, this is the final step away from feudalism and the foundation of modern European capitalism. Here we have Bonaventura Berlinghieri's altarpiece of St. Francis of 1235, the first image of the saint, displaying the stigmata with his hands and on his feet. We also find that he is wearing a three-knotted rope, representing the three different characteristics of Franciscans: poverty, chastity, and obedience, that all of them are going to dedicate their lives to. Off to the side, we will notice that we have an image of the saint and then stories associated with his various miracles. Therefore, like the Byzantine Vita icon, we have his portrait surrounded by his life, just like that of St. Nicholas that we discussed would be very influential in the Latin West. Here we find that this is modeled on the influx of Greek works available in Italy at the time. Here we can see St. Francis receiving the stigmata from the image of Christ as a seraphim, with the stigmata in his hands and his feet, shooting them down to that of St. Francis. Here we find St. Francis is also going to be performing one of his miracles, where he talks to birds and other animals. The influx of works that would influence such Vita icons comes from Constantinople and the sack in 1204 by Crusaders, following the war with the Turks. At this time, Christians are going to rule over an eastern portion that was left over of the Roman Empire. And so they speak Greek, they were Christians, and they were allies of the Western Christians, the Latin Christians as well. However, we find that the Western powers found it easier to sack Constantinople than making their way entirely to Jerusalem during the Fourth Crusade. Now, when they are able to regain control of their country, the Byzantines had already lost a considerable amount of territory, and we find that Muslims flooded in, leaving a large number of refugees to flee this area, to flee over through the Mediterranean to areas that are friendly to Christians, specifically ports along the Italian peninsula. They brought with them the maniera greca, or the Greek manner, artworks in the style of Orthodox Christianity in Byzantium. The format for these new works in the maniera greca were very often icons. So the refugees brought these portable paintings that were used for private devotion. These become the model for early modern painting, and the format we all take for granted today, which would be an easel painting mounted on a wall. This form of painting did not exist in the West as we know it. The most common type of painting, in fact, in Europe at the time, outside of painting sculptures, would be crucifixes that were not mounted on a wall, but instead would hang on choir screens or from above an altar as seen here. This maniera greca, or Byzantine manner, is going to be seen here in the stylized or incised set of contours, the elongation of the figural proportions, and the emphasis on replicating a prototype, not making it look like something from reality. So we find here that the crucifix is actually historiated, with narrative scenes or episodes in the life of Christ's passion off to the sides. The crucifixion is going to be taken from Byzantine models, with the Christus patiens, or the dead suffering Christ, with his head looking down to his right. And once again, the concave kind of rib cage, with the careful delineation of contours of the musculature and the musculoskeletal system. Instead of having the figures, though, of the Virgin Mary and John the Evangelist to the side, they are in historiated registers. Here we can also see how similar this was to three-dimensional models. Now this is painted, but the idea of having a crucifix or Christ on the cross was common ever since the Romanesque era and the Ottonian periods. Finally, the idea of having a central figure flanked by smaller narrative scenes is going to be well established at this point in the Dugento or 1200s, thanks to the popularity of the Vita icon, such as that by Bonaventura Berlinghieri. The style for these crucifixes was immediately influenced by the maniera greca, which is going to be defined by that emphasis in contours, in chrysography, and on the suffering appropriate for these crucifixion scenes brought over from Byzantium. The historiated crucifix seen here, where we have a massive body of Christ on a cross, with additional narrative scenes and episodes from the Passion, are going to become quite common and popular, especially in the late 1200s in Italy. Here we have episodes where Christ is led to the cross, where he dies and is taken off the cross and entombed, where he resurrects and judges above, based on the Pantocrator from the Byzantine tradition that we have already discussed, where he holds the book. He holds up his right hand in a blessing of benediction and is identified in this body mandorla and the halo behind his head as Christ the Judge. The comparison between Copo de Marcavoldo's crucifix and that we discussed in the Church of Dormition and Daphne is going to be quite obvious. We find here we have an emphasis on the incised lines, the contours that make up Christ's musculature and body, as it sags to the left, his head looking down to his right and our left, towards the saved, just as in the Second Coming and crucifixion scenes and the Last Judgment scenes, he looks down to the saved. We find that this is the Christus patiens, the suffering Christ. The faces of the figures also are going to be contorted, yet at the same time drawn quite clearly, with the scouring and the scowl seen very clearly in Christ's brow and forehead. In an ironic twist, the popes who seek to canonize St. Francis and bring him within the Catholic fold commission for this man who dedicated his life to the poor the richest and most lushly decorated church of the day, which now is going to be a pilgrimage church to St. Francis himself and the town of Assisi where he was from. This massive church, perched on top of a hillside, is going to be modeled very similarly after Sainte-Chapelle, for it has an upper and a lower story, and functions as a pilgrimage church for the saint, who was buried, just like at Old St. Peter's, in the area directly below the main altar. As with Old St. Peter's, X marks the spot, because the crypt is at the choir end underneath both, the crossing right directly beneath it, the cycle of frescoes below by Cimabue, and then those above by the Master of Assisi, are going to be important when thinking of how we move ahead to the Renaissance. The upper church is in fact well lit and uninterrupted by anything on the walls, so it is designed for large fresco cycles instead of broken up by pier clusters or additional stained glass windows. They illustrate the life of St. Francis, flanked by Old Testament scenes, hence anchoring this new saint into the typological tradition of the past. The stories shown here are going to be designed to engage spectators, to engage viewers in an appeal to life experiences, things that we have all seen, that we have all done. Hence, we're emphasizing recognizable anecdotal details and naturalistic space over supernatural visions. In the Miracle of the Crib at Greccio, you have one of these examples where St. Francis is going to set up a nativity scene with the ox and the axe, with once again a baby doll for the Christ child. And then those present are going to witness a miraculous vision of what it was like to be at the nativity. But it is presented not in an emphasis of the supernatural aspects of the story, but anchoring it into something we would see in this very church through naturalistic details. Now this is set in the present Gothic church, where the oral component we see of individuals singing we would hear as well with friars singing in this church, because it is of course also a monastery with Franciscan monks in it. The cross that we see here in the choir screen dividing the nave from the choir is the back of a crucifix, much like the one we saw a moment ago with Copo di Marcovoldo's design. So now we can see behind the scenes, quite literally, of what this church visit would have been like. People dressed in contemporary attire. We're looking at contemporary architecture. This approach and tradition of having a contemporary setting, but involving a recognizable crowd, right, is not going to be new. We're setting this in a recognizable place, but moving into a much more naturalistic presentation of the event. A very different interest and situation is going to be developing in Italy, for the tumultuous history where this peninsula will be conquered by various powers throughout the Middle Ages is slowly developing its own independence and its own nationality. Here we find that the Holy Roman Empire will lose control of southern Italy and Naples by the middle of the 1200s. In the north, we also find, interestingly enough, independent city-states or communes will be developing with communal governments. Hence, we find these republican governments are going to be great patrons of the arts. One of those is going to be Pisa, which we looked at during the Romanesque period. At Pisa, we have an area where, since Charlemagne, Holy Roman emperors have sent artists to study, fostering this classical revival in an attempt to control Italy, but also this tradition. Frederick II was the last ruler of Italy. He was also a poet, an artist, and a naturalist, and encouraged his own artists to study ancient sculpture there. One of the best collections of ancient sculpture, believe it or not, did not come by way of freestanding examples such as the Belvedere collection in the Vatican, but instead in the Campo Santo, that rectangular structure seen here behind the baptistry, had one of the best collections in the later Middle Ages of Roman sarcophagi. So artists could actually look at what Romans had produced and model their own works on that type of monumentality and powerful representation, especially of relief friezes. The Campo Santo, importantly, is going to be a burial place where dirt from Jerusalem was brought back so that the elite of Pisa could be buried in the same soil as their savior. Here we have examples like the Phaedra and Hippolytus sarcophagus, which illustrate the classical relief frieze that Renaissance artists to follow would be so inspired by, where we have monumental figures that are going to be on a unified ground plane that are read left to right, just like a book. Now, that type of art would inspire the artist to create reliefs such as can be found in the baptistry pulpit in Pisa. This one specifically designed by Nicola Pisano, or Nicholas the Pisan, which is roughly 15 feet tall, still there today. Now, this artist was a leading proponent of the new classical approach to art and a new or renewed naturalistic style in sculpture. Now, the associations that we have here with the Germans or the Holy Roman Empire cannot be overlooked, for we have a six-sided hexagonal pulpit with Corinthian capitals supporting these standing figures, but with Gothic trefoil arches referencing the Germans, just as the Hallenkirche had as well with the three-lobe design. Here, in the most famous of the panels, the Annunciation, Nativity, and Adoration of the Shepherds, we have a single relief panel that has multiple episodes from the early life of Christ, beginning in the back left with the Annunciation that Gabriel gives to the Virgin Mary, that she will become pregnant and give birth to the Son of God, to the massive reclining Virgin in the center after she has given birth and the Christ child is being washed off by these nursemaids below, with Joseph watching on in the lower left-hand corner. And finally, in the upper right-hand corner, an adoration to the shepherds as the angels announce where to find Christ. This is known as a continuous narrative, where multiple episodes of the same story can be found within the same picture plane, thus maximizing the narrative and the space and the materials involved, so that we can see what happens over a larger chronological period. The design for Pisano's pulpit here, and the figures within, is directly inspired by the sarcophagi found in the Camposanto, such as the Phaedra and Hippolytus sarcophagus, where we find examples of massive reclining women of these standing figures, all monumentalized and brought together. The figure of the Virgin is, of course, going to be based on that of Phaedra here, as we find this classical matriarch in the Roman tradition leans on her right arm and elbow and supports herself with this veil over her head. The monumentality, of course, is going to communicate the power of this woman, just as it is going to the bulk and power of the Virgin Mary here. Now, these ideas, visual ideas and examples and prototypes, as well as the ideas that are going to be taken from these Grecian manuscripts brought by the Byzantines fleeing the Turks in the East, are going to be very important for Dante, for Petrarch, for Boccaccio, and we see that even in England with people like Chaucer, the rise of secularism is going to coincide with these ideas that are brought to Europe at this time. The idea that mankind is going to be powerful and has the ability to understand their world through reason and rationality. So we see the rise of the middle class at this time, in Florence especially, the cradle of the Renaissance, and the decline of feudalism. So now we have the establishment of modern capitalism, whereby through free trade and a free market, individuals who may be born of a relatively low station can gain great notoriety and power thanks to this new system, this economic system. Now in Florence, what do they do with that wealth? They patronize works of art. So this is why Florence, being the cradle of the Renaissance and the largest city in Italy at the time, or I should say in Europe at the time, with 100,000 people, once we get to 1400, is going to be built around a series of guilds who are all in competition with one another, and they're vying for the best artists. This is how you demonstrate your validity, your spirituality, your piety, and your value in this civilization that is highly Christian. You patronize works of art.
This, of course, is going to make you very visible in your community and is also going to ensure that everyone knows what a good and pious person you are. So it's here that we find the Renaissance being born, these ideas all coming together that we discussed, from the French International Gothic style to German naturalism to the Byzantine Maniera Greca, all of which are going to come together to form a new style. Now, it is because of the Fourth Lateran Council and the establishment of the idea of transubstantiation, where, through the Eucharist, you find that priests bless the consecrated host and wine, and it literally becomes the body and blood of Christ. So because of this, we need a new type of decoration, a new altarpiece decoration, as it were. Prior to that, as you see here in the Church of Santa Croce that still hangs, Italian painters like Coppa di Marcavoldo, we looked at in medieval art, are going to paint crucifixes that hang from the wooden rafters generally, far above an altar, not directing our attention to the altar itself. But you'll notice that he is still influenced by this Greek manner, these hard contours and outline. So with this new requirement and needing a new type of decoration, we have, with the altarpiece, the need for a painting or a work of art that decorates an altar to draw our attention to it. And the first model for these altarpieces are going to be those icons brought by Byzantine refugees from the Far East. So we find that in the first great precursor to the Renaissance and the first artist listed in Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists, those famous artists who are going to become known household names, right, such as Leonardo, Michelangelo, Donatello. These are all going to be written, the biographies, by Vasari. And it all begins with Cimabue, which is a nickname, right, given to him, which means ox head. So he's either going to be very stubborn or ugly. A very common tradition in Italy is to give people nicknames. So Cimabue, being the first artist, is going to adopt the format and some of the style from the Maniera Greca, or these Byzantine artists who are going to be fleeing, right, and people fleeing the east from the Turks. And he's going to monumentalize it. This is a 12-foot tall, 7-foot wide painting. So over life-size figures such as the Madonna here dominate a church, making him visible from the very back of the nave, far away from the altar. Everyone can see this painting that glistens with gold. Alright, so this is an altarpiece, meaning that it's designed to sit on and decorate and draw attention to an altar where priests are going to perform the Eucharist. It is painted with tempera on panel, much like the other Byzantine icons we just looked at, that being it's painted with an egg yolk binder, right? So you mix pigment with egg and it dries rapidly. It has a luminous matte finish and is great for details. So the subject and the format here is Byzantine, that being the Madonna and Child enthroned, the Hodegetria pose, where she is pointing to the way, that Christ is the way to salvation, while she is the Theotokos, the Mother of God, the Queen of Heaven. We see her here on a heavenly throne, with a heavenly background of gold leaf, with angels surrounding the throne, 8 of them supporting, very gently placing their hands on the throne, while Old Testament prophets are below, who foretold the coming of Christ, holding their prophecies, literally supporting the New Testament figures above. So if you compare this to the Madonna and Child enthroned, the icon panel painting that is in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., we can see the obvious subject matter that has been adopted here by the Italian Cimabue, and how some of the style also remains consistent, whereby we still have a Madonna and Child enthroned, so we have a very clear throne, a gold background. The Madonna is wearing blue and red, blue being the most expensive color and pigment, ultramarine blue, that you could actually buy at the time. So it is reserved for her. The Christ child is seated on her left leg. She is pointing to him with her right hand, and the Christ child holds his writings in his left hand and blesses us with his right hand, this blessing of benediction. He also retains the cruciform halo, or the equidistant armed halo behind his head. All of which, including the angels behind the throne, are going to be consistent. Right? What is different and very interesting here is what we will see moving us ahead into the Renaissance and what makes Cimabue important and as a starting place for all of the Italian Renaissance. Now, of course, it's not just the prototype or the subject matter seen in the Maniera Greca or the Byzantine manner that is going to be dominant here. The subject matter obviously is the same, but we have a gentle twisting and graceful contrapposto pose of the Virgin Mary, who relaxes her right knee, lifting it up, while her left is going to be placed on the bottom step of her throne. This swaying motion makes her body into an S shape, like that we see in international Gothic sculptures, like that at Reims. Right? A graceful twisting is going to be appropriate for this courtly style that's very popular and coming out of France. Even the angels on either side of the throne are going to sway rhythmically back and forth, giving you a serpentine-like quality. Now, what moves us ahead and what is important about Cimabue is, yes, it does take from this Eastern format. Yes, it does adopt the graceful motions of the International Gothic style, but it does something different. It actually suggests a space, that we actually see the figures are going to occupy space, though not very naturalistically yet. We can see that the throne stair steps back from the foreground to the midground, and the angels overlap one another. They are not hovering in space outside of our understanding of spatial units and time, but instead their halos overlap one another, and we can locate them based on where their hands are located on the throne. So this interest in volumetric weight and volumetric solidity in figures is a hallmark to Florentine or Tuscan painting that becomes central to the Renaissance as they become obsessed with mathematics and how that leads to beauty and art. All right, so this is uniquely Florentine. We do not see it in other areas until we get to the mid-15th century, when Florentine artists are going to expand and be working outside of Tuscany for various patrons in the north and in Rome. Now, turning to the artist who would carry on Cimabue, his master's approach, that is Giotto di Bondone. So Giotto is heralded by Giorgio Vasari as the true precursor to the Renaissance that builds on the investigations by Cimabue and moves the art world forward with his monumental leap, interested in volumetric shape, using bulky forms and clearly laying out figures for narrative and even iconic scenes. So here in his Ognissanti Madonna, or the All Saints Madonna, a nickname because of the number of Madonna and Childs we have, we must give them different nicknames. Here you're going to have a painting that illustrates how he's taking from Cimabue and then moving forward, advancing these ideas. So if you compare it, we have the same subject matter. We still have the Madonna and Child enthroned. She still is shown as the Mother of God. We still have a gold background. We still have an iconic scene that will not change. These angels kneel in the foreground. In this instance, they're going to be wearing white and with lilies, showing the purity of the Virgin Mary, as you find Gabriel will, at the Annunciation, be holding this flower to show that she is pure and is the appropriate candidate for bearing the Mother of God, or being the Mother of God. Now, as far as, however, the major difference that we see is that the space and the space occupied by these various figures is much more believable, instead of the tilted perspective used by Cimabue, where the figures seem to be stacked up and pressed or squeezed against the front of the picture plane here, right? This imaginary glass plane that separates us from these fictive and illusionistic figures. Now Cimabue, or Giotto, is going to be locating them on a much more level field, as though the ground on which they stand is perpendicular to the picture plane. Thus, it appears more naturalistic. They even overlap one another more believably, cutting each other off. And we even see them overlapping the throne itself. Now, if we look at the Virgin Mary and Christ child in detail, you can also see what Giotto takes from Cimabue and moves forward and advances this idea, because he has a very careful tonal modulation with bright highlights for the brows, the cheeks, the chin, the bridge of the nose, for instance, and then gently is going to transition to dark shadow off to the side. This, of course, gives the figures a weighty roundness, right, which makes them occupy space, giving them a heavy visual weight that appears much more three-dimensional. And if you look at the figures behind them, he's considering how visually certain elements will cut off others. It is much more believable to show figures behind a throne, partially concealed by it. And then, of course, the halos concealing or cutting off people's faces, if we are to take the three-dimensional qualities of these objects into consideration. Now, this comes from the early Christian or late antique interest in heavy, weighty, bulky forms. So just like Pisano with the Pisan pulpit, you find that Giotto is looking to these ancient Roman examples to try to suggest weight, to try to show how heavy the forms are that actually occupy space, that actually take up, all right, an area and can be located next to one another very clearly and consistently. Now, the greatest commission that Giotto would receive, and the best surviving fresco cycle that we have of any artist in the Trecento or 1300s, comes to us by way of the city of Padua and the wealthiest man in that city, who happened to be the Pope's banker at the time, and that's going to be Enrico Scrovegni. So here we have the Scrovegni chapel that Giotto will be brought in to paint in fresco, with the subjects being the life of the Virgin Mary and of Christ. And we need to know why this chapel is going to be made, which is the private chapel of the wealthiest man in this city and arguably in Italy at this time. Because Enrico Scrovegni, as the Pope's banker, is a well-known usurer. So the usurer, or the sin of usury, is lending money for interest. So we find that this profession is begun by his father, Reginaldo Scrovegni, who's actually mentioned by name in Dante's Inferno for being in hell for the sin of usury. Therefore, being a very famous sinner in hell, Enrico fears for his own soul. So he commissions this chapel for the expiation of his sins in order to cleanse his soul, having the Pope come here and bless it, consecrate it in 1305, which means that once it was blessed, anyone who visited this chapel on that day would get a plenary indulgence or have their sins wiped clean. Now, Dante is going to be very influential for social satire. His Divine Comedy, or Divina Commedia, is going to be broken into three different sections: the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, or the Hell, Purgatory, and Paradise. The most famous one and the most widely read being the Inferno, that you're probably familiar with, as Dante is taken through the levels of hell, all 9 levels, by Virgil, the famous ancient Roman poet who wrote the most extensive description of Hades himself. So finding his father in hell, in this 7th level, where usurers are going to be naked with a bag of money tied around their neck and have fire rain down upon them, we find that we have a very visceral and vivid image of what is awaiting Enrico in the afterlife. So he needs to avoid this punishment. But we will continue to discuss how influential Dante's description of hell is, as he divides each level into different types of sins, with different types of punishments appropriate for those sinners. And we'll see that again here in another chapel, in another commission for the Last Judgment. Now, the episode running around in ring-like fashion, the chapel from top to bottom, you're going to have the birth to death of the Virgin Mary and Christ. So moving around, we also were going to have allegories up in the top section and around the spandrels of prudence, fortitude, temperance, and the other cardinal virtues. Now, this entire scene of the life of Christ and the life of the Virgin Mary centers on a last judgment, which carries on that Romanesque tradition where Christ returns at the end of time, described by St. John the Evangelist in the book of Revelations, and judges, separating the sheep from the goats. And it's very consistent as to how the scene must be organized, with sinners on the left side of Christ and the saved on the right side. Thus, given that he faces us, the saved will always be, or the elect, the holy elect, will be on our left, and the damned will be on our right. So what happens at the end of time? The trumpets are going to sound. So we have angels up here above the oval mandorla of Christ with trumpets announcing the end of time is going to be at hand. In the upper sections, you find the sun and the moon are going to be rolled up by angels who are going to signal the end of time and space. So this is taken from, as an organization, all of those Romanesque examples that precede it, where Christ is in the center with an oval mandorla or a rainbow halo around him, a body halo, often with angels surrounding him. As he separates out the holy elect, you can see them in this house down below, right, the saved, and then the mouth of hell and Satan tormenting them to the right. Right, you can see even in his gesture, he lifts up those on the right and casts down those on the left. So in this example, where people are coming up, right, on our left or his right, and are cast down on our right or his left, the same organization. Above, we're going to find the angels rolling up time and space. Behind the blue sky, you'll notice a gold of heaven, just like with those altarpieces, and there is no time or space in heaven. It is non-narrative. Nothing happens. So we are in the final phase of history where it is closed off, where the final reckoning is at hand. Christ himself is going to be in the standard dress with his toga. We find that he is illustrating his wounds that he received on the cross, with the wounds from the nails in his hands and feet, and the spear wound he received from St. Longinus in his side. He looks down as he's seated on and supported by seraphim, the highest order of angels. He looks down to the saved, right, directing his attention to those that followed his teachings, whereby he's shunning or turning the back of his hand to those who did not, the goats. Below, we find that a donor portrait, or a painting of the person that paid for this chapel, is going to be found with Enrico Scrovani receiving the blessing from the three Marys here. And it's supported by a monk, that being the church supports this particular gesture, this gift that Enrico is giving to them in exchange for salvation. So it's very clear as to why he is issuing this, because he states clearly in his will that being all of his ill-gotten gains should be given back to those that he took them from, and that we should have priests on hand for all of the rest of history, all the rest of time before the Last Judgment, praying on his behalf to ensure that his salvation is guaranteed. So we know in black and white from his will why he's commissioning this. Now, what he's afraid of is very specific torment for those that are lustful or greedy. Both sins are seen in the sin of prostitution and of usury. So we find that 4 rivers of fire are going to cast down diminutive, tiny, nude human figures that are tormented by blue demons and centered around a blue devil seated on a dragon throne, eternally gnashing with his 3 mouths, the 3 greatest traitors, Brutus, Cassius, and Judas. He then, of course, defecates them out and eats them again. So if you look closely, there are lots of torments related to genital mutilation or sexual torment. You can see off here to the right as they're hung upside down by their genitals, or you have their penis wrenched off, or prostitution, right, seen down here. Those are the sins of lust and of greed that seem to come together with usury. Here we even have Judas, who hangs, right, off alone by himself as the first betrayer of Christ, who betrayed Christ for money, just like it is seen that usurers betray Christ for money. All right, so this is not new. The idea of tormenting sinners, especially those that are guilty of lust or greed, goes back to the first last judgments from the Romanesque era, such as that by Gislibertus, where we find nude female forms are going to be bitten by snakes, for instance, on the breast, and or chained, right, by their sins. Now, the narrative scenes are very important here because they illustrate a new approach, a new storytelling approach that Giotto is so famous for. We see this in examples like the Lamentation, which follows the crucifixion of Christ, where he's brought off the cross and is lamented, and or is going to find that the figures present at the crucifixion are going to weep to show us how we should feel about the death of Christ. Right, so here the entire scene and the composition and all the figures tell us who we should look at and how we should feel, and this is what Giotto is known for. Right, so you find that with the affetti that he develops, this affectation or system of rhetorical gestures, he's going to show us in a theatrical fashion how figures behave when sad or when angry, or the standard emotions that we need to externalize to know how we should feel, how we should interpret the scene. So the Virgin Mary is going to be quivering as far as her lip as she cries and brings her brow together, simulating the facial features of sadness, while other figures wring their hands and fling them out, right, in these gestures of lamentation. They're lamenting the death of Christ. They are sad, right? We're supposed to empathize with this pathos here. Above, you even have the angels wringing their hands and crying as well with the death of the Son of God. So you find that the composition, including the craggy outcropping in the back, draws our eye down to Christ, directly to his head. The angels themselves wring their hands, right, and dive bomb him, bringing us down as the figures themselves surround Christ, all looking in at him. Everyone laments his passing. Everyone cries, including the Mary Magdalene with the red hair at his feet, right? So we know how we should feel. We know what part of the narrative we are in, and we know exactly who we should be looking at. Now, this interest is coupled by a consistent falling of light, the use of heavy, weighty, bulky forms through very careful tonal modulation, and how we would actually arrange figures or see them located in space if we were there at the time. Now, this clarity of subject matter and gestures, where figures are on a shallow, stage-like space, and the use of naturalism, which allows us to relate to these characters, comes from the propaganda from ancient Rome. If you look at the ancient Roman monuments that still exist scattered around Europe, we find the same large-scale figures with clear rhetorical gestures, talking and engaging with one another. So again, what is Giotto doing but looking to these ancient pagan examples to then use to tell Christian stories? Another example of how we filter, right, Christianity through paganism. Now, here is the betrayal of Christ to illustrate the difference between Florentine approach to narrative painting and that of Sienese, whereby we find that Judas comes in with a yellow cloak, envelops Christ, looks up and kisses him, while figures point towards who we should be looking at, and even the torches and the batons above lead us back down to Christ's head. Even St. Peter at the right, who cuts off the ear of the servant, is going to point us back towards Christ. This gesture clearly a counterpoint to the figure pointing all the way to the right. So if we look at the semiotic sentence of Judas kisses Christ, we see that Giotto's approach is much more clear, as we can follow along the same line where all the figures are actually going to be pointing and what they are doing. So you find that we begin by moving right to left. As we move in, pointing, everyone marching towards Christ. The brightest hue, that of yellow, envelops him here in the center. And if we try to move past, St. Peter points us right back towards his head. So the clarity of the approach to the narrative and the monumentality of the figures will be the central components that will lead to the Renaissance after we see the revival from the Black Death and the recuperation of the population of Florence and Siena after the Black Death. Turning to Siena in the south, we have a very different style that's being adopted, largely because they are the rivals of the Florentines, as we discussed, and they're at war with each other constantly. They differentiate themselves from this interest in volumetric solidity and of mathematics, of space. Instead, they align themselves more closely with the graceful international Gothic style seen in France. So here, we're going to see that in the Cathedral of Siena, a new wonderful altarpiece, and a very elaborate altarpiece, the most expensive one commissioned in the entire century, will be made to decorate the high altar here. And this is the setting for a miracle, as the Sienese now. And that miracle is going to come by way of the Virgin Mary interceding on their behalf in the Battle of Monteperti of 1260. On the eve of battle, we have the general for the Sienese kneeling before an image of the Virgin Mary at the high altar here in the Cathedral of Siena, as he is outnumbered by 15,000 troops. So he's about to go into battle, and he prays to the Virgin Mary and asks that if she will help them defeat the Florentines in the upcoming battle, that he will dedicate the city to her. Now, in this battle, which pitted the Guelphs against the Ghibellines, or those that back the papacy against those that back the Holy Roman Emperor, the Florentines back the Pope, and this will become very important in the next century because the Medici will become the papal bankers, and so they come out on top and will eventually overwhelm the Sienese. But in this battle, the Sienese prevail, and they are very proud of them. Now here is the image, the Madonna degli Occhi Grossi, or the Madonna of the Big Eyes, to which the Sienese general was actually praying. It was an antependium, literally meaning ante for before, and pendere to hang. So it hangs before an altar. So it was the precursor to an altarpiece that will be commissioned because the Virgin Mary, according to the Sienese, interceded on their behalf and allowed them to win the day. So here is the main panel of the painting commissioned in thanks to the Virgin Mary for delivering them in the battle against the Florentines, and it is given to Duccio. So Duccio is going to work from 1308 to 11, being given the commission by the Opera del Duomo. That's going to be the works of the cathedral, the organization in charge of decorating and enriching the cathedral. So the commission was given to him in 1308 to make this massive Sacra Conversazione. So the Sacra Conversazione, or Holy Conversation, is going to gather together holy persons from many different parts of the world, from different eras. They lived and died at different times. Therefore, it is a miracle that they would be brought together in the same place to converse, to speak with one another. And so we, having them together, are able to pray to all of them at the same time, simultaneously. Thus, we get this critical mass of holiness that can intercede on our behalf, that can help us. Different saints that are in charge of different aspects of our lives. And, of course, the Virgin Mary, the most important one, who can intercede on our behalf for Christ, right? So that's why she is saintly as well. So in this, we have the continuation of that Gothic format and the Byzantine format, whereby you have the Madonna in blue, seated on a throne, in this case that looks like the Sienese Cathedral in which we are viewing this. And we have the Christ child seated on the left knee of the Virgin Mary, while the Madonna points to him with her right hand. So the graceful swaying of the figures on either side of the throne is similar in both paintings. But On the front, which is an iconic rendering, that being nothing is ever going to change in this instance, it is non-narrative. It is not a story. They're always going to be in heaven there for us to pray to. But even here and on the back, we do not see the same interest in volumetric solidarity that you find with Cimabue and Florentine painters. Duccio is much more interested in the graceful swaying and elegance and courtly elegance of the International Gothic. Now, the front is merely what the congregation sees of the Maestà, and originally you would have had a massive frame that would look like the Gothic cathedral in which we are seeing this. So it is a church, because through the church you gain salvation, through the Virgin Mary Christ was produced, and through him we gain salvation. So it is appropriate that she sits on the throne, because she is often referred to as the church, and we see the actual painting is the church. Now, above and below, we would have had additional narrative paintings relating the life of the Virgin Mary from birth to death, and then on the back we have the life of Christ, primarily the episodes from his Passion. But those are going to be painted on the pinnacles above and the predella, as we call it, which is the skirt of the altarpiece, those tiny paintings below that support the base of it. Right, so the 9 predella paintings on the front and the 9 on the back are going to give us further narrative scenes, which are not iconic like the main panel we see in the center. Instead, they tell stories, and here we have the rebirth of an interest in storytelling for these precursors to the Renaissance. Now, the 26 panels on the back that illustrate the life of Christ do much to indicate how indebted the Sienese were, and Duccio was, to the international style. So this is going to also illustrate the difference between a narrative and iconic painting. For we now can see that these artists are trying to illustrate biblical stories and show us a beginning, a middle, and an end to the story, the most popular being that of the Passion of Christ, or the story that leads to his crucifixion and resurrection. So here, with the betrayal of Christ highlighted where it is located in the back panels, one of the 26 panel paintings on the back that we need to walk around to see. Hence, we would only be able to see this if we were a priest or an acolyte, able to come behind the high altar. But here in the story of the betrayal of Christ, you're going to find the episode where Judas kisses Christ in the center here. You see him. Christ is still going to be holding his right hand out blessing, pointing us to St. Peter at the left, who cuts off the ear of the servant who is going to be following the Roman soldiers to arrest Christ. So remember, Christ stops him, picks up the ear, and heals this man. Off to the right, you can see that as the Roman soldiers approach, the rest of the apostles, sans St. Peter, are going to flee. So they all run away here, very clearly separating with this V-shaped gap here, the group that surrounds Christ, right, and them that flee looking back fearfully. Now in the background, we still have the same gold leaf sky, showing how wealthy a commission this would have been. This is real gold that's here. And then these tiny trees. All right, the craggy landscape behind does not necessarily do much to showcase where the figures are located in space, but merely sets it outdoors, out where Christ will pray, asking for this cup to pass him the night before he is arrested, that begins the Passion. You'll notice that even the feet down here of the apostles and Christ, right, are often dangling off of this precipice, this craggy outcropping right here. So they're not even anchored clearly on the ground or casting shadows. But that's not the point. It is interested in this graceful swaying, this S-shaped composition for the figures, the pastel-like colors of purples, of bright greens, yellows, right? So this is a very rich, extravagant painting celebrating the wealth of the materials and of the people that commissioned it. Now, the swaying comes from illuminated manuscripts and books of hours, such as that of Jean Poussel, that made its way around Europe, thus spreading this international Gothic style from Germany to England to Italy. So everyone is familiar with this style, and it is appreciated by aristocrats and courtiers alike, whereby this is how you would appear and behave in court. So they would model the hairstyles, the facial features, and how you would stand and act after courtiers, individuals who would be in the king's court. So therefore it was a very sought after, a very posh and a very appreciated aristocratic style. So if you compare them, you can easily see that we are surrounding Christ here with the betrayal of all of these figures, much more concerned with the graceful interlocking nature of these forms, as opposed to clearly setting them out in space.
Thus, in Trecento, Italy, or the 14th century, we find there is a development of panel painting from Byzantine icons, leading to modern painting as we know it. There is also the reemergence of narrative art that was dormant since antiquity, arguably. A renewed interest in naturalism, that being how things appear in nature by way of tonal modulation, light and shadow, and anatomy, and a slow movement away from both the Byzantine and the Gothic styles. Now, turning to late medieval Germany, we find a very different approach in the regional adaptation of the said Gothic style.
Now, to review Germanic art seen in the Holy Roman Empire as that we reviewed in the first survey, seen with St. Maurice and Eckhart and Uta, is going to reveal a type of naturalism and psychological insight and realism that is lacking anywhere else in Europe. Because they are in the north and because they are distant from the Greco-Roman classical tradition, they do not base their sculptures on those seen in the classical world, such as ancient Greece and Rome. Instead, they adopted the figures as they appeared, making portraits of living individuals with anecdotal details included. Right, so they're polychrome to look as naturalistic as possible, and they include ethnographic specifics such as racial markers, for instance. This is what the Germans are interested in. Now, in the latter half of the 14th century, we have many current events that further drive this interest in psychological realism and naturalism even further. And Louis. Now, in Germany, the Holy Roman Empire is still going to exist, having been founded by the first Holy Roman Emperor, Charlemagne, in 800 Common Era. So the Holy Roman Empire still exists as a loose conglomeration of principalities and states, ruled separately by dukes, right, and these little duchies, with a figurehead, much like the Queen of England, named the Holy Roman Emperor, overseeing them. So this is no longer going to represent a significant power in Europe at this time, but the traditions still do continue. Right, so just to show you an image of the various principalities that make up Germany today in these various counties, such as Bavaria, for instance, or Prussia, Pomerania, right, in the northern section here. So all of these are going to loosely be affiliated and speak German, and they will pledge loyalty to the Holy Roman Emperor, but they fight one another. So it's at this time that they lose control over Italy, they lose control over Sicily to England, and we see the decline in German power. Now, the emperors, again, only have nominal authority over these independent principalities, and this is further fragmented by the events of the latter half of the 14th century.
These territories were split into the current states that we know: Bohemia, Austria, Bavaria, and so on. In the north, we have the so-called Mercantile League, led by free cities, whereas to the south, we find the Rhineland is going to be populated by and controlled by the papacy. Therefore, they remain Catholic to this day. Now, the cities along the Rhineland, or Rhine River, would adopt the new Gothic style first. Cities such as Strasbourg. Here we can see Strasbourg Cathedral, begun in 1277. Now the city, not surprisingly, is now in France, with the border moving back and forth along the Rhine and with both world wars. German and French are still going to be spoken today in a type of mixed dialect. Now here we can see that the apse and transept are in the Romanesque style, but this facade and spire are going to be completed in this Gothic style. Here we can see the single spire at the left completed with the massive rose window in the center. The facade is in fact from the rayonnant, or the radiating style that we discussed with Sainte-Chapelle. That is the style of the late Gothic, the end of the evolution in France. The bar tracery can be seen spreading out with an open spire later in the 15th century. Here we can see the tracery leading to the expansion of this massive rose window here at Strasbourg. The screen of tracery is actually 2 feet deep, with trellis-like ornaments surrounded by this rose window. As in England, we find this is a regional adaptation of the French Gothic, focusing on the transition between the decorative elements in the spires and this trellis work to the rose window behind. We can see similarities in the massive cathedral at Reims with a rose window that is actually going to be flanked by the various elements of the church portal. Now we can see even more sculptural elements are going to hide the structure of the church with this trellis-like design. Here, looking straight up, we can see the sculptural ornamentation and the emphasis placed on sculptural ornament here at Strasbourg. The freestanding elements actually break the horizontal divisions of the facade, thus masking the structure, much like we discussed here in Notre Dame in Paris. The sculptural decorations are going to be traditionally on the sides of the church portal, much like at Chartres. Here we can see Satan and the foolish virgins, flanked by Christ and the wise virgins. The subject we began talking about with the Rosano Gospels back in the 6th century, whereby the wise virgins carry flaming torches, wear white chitons of purity with Christ, whereas the foolish virgins are going to have different colors and are going to be led here by a youthful Satan the seducer, with snakes and toads crawling on his garment. He tempts the virgins to bite the forbidden fruit, whereby the virgins discard their lamps as well. If we compare the style here from the Virgin and Child in Sainte-Chapelle to that in the Strasbourg Cathedral, we see the same types of sculptural elements with the S-shaped rhythmic curves, the serpentine-like patterns, and the same type of almond-shaped eyes and idealized facial features of those at court. The tympana on the transepts are also going to be decorated with sculpture. In this case, the Dormition or death of the Virgin, seen here, and the Assumption of the Virgin. Here with the Dormition, we see that Christ is going to be surrounded by the apostles who gather together at the deathbed of the Virgin Mary. Christ comes back and appears at this point, holding the soul of the Virgin Mary in his left hand, while he lifts his right in a blessing of benediction. We find all the figures with very large heads are crowded in this claustrophobic scene, pushed around the bed of the Virgin Mary. We find that the face and drapery of the Virgin actually comes from that of Reims, as she's going to be twisting with her head moving to the right and or to her left. The twisted gestures, the psychological drama and throbbing lines, along with the angular movements, are all foreign to the French Gothic. These are all indigenous traits in Germany. Obviously, we see similar traits in Byzantine art, but the Germans are going to appreciate this type of psychological insight, as we will see later on with Vesperbild as well. Now we can see this notion of having these various figures with larger heads in this confined space, discussing things with one another. This will foretell Germanic sculpture up until the 15th century, and what makes it unique. Turning now to Cologne, which is also on the Rhine, we have another very important late medieval church. Here we have the most impressive German Gothic church at 515 feet high. This is the largest and tallest church that we will look at in this class. Begun in 1248, it would not be completed, however, until 1880. Now, it's mostly a 19th century Gothic revival based on the original Master Michael's plan of 1350. In 1880, it becomes the largest cathedral in Northern Europe. Here we can see the side of it with the flying buttresses and the traditional lancet windows, as well as the spires. Now we find that in 1164, the Cologne Cathedral will receive the relics of the three magi, as we discussed here with the Shrine of the Three Kings, finished in 1230 by Nicholas of Verdun. Master Gerard is going to begin rebuilding the structure in order to make it known that this new relic belongs here. He rebuilds it in the French Gothic cathedral style of Amiens, illustrating the local opposition to the Hohenstaufens. In other words, they are against the ruling family in Germany, so they align themselves with the French style. Here, the cathedral at Amiens can be seen to be directly influential for Cologne, which has a much smaller transept, collapsing it into the nave itself with these bulbous chapels that can be seen up at the top, much like that of an ambulatory. The 150-foot high ceiling here that we have in Cologne is also like the choir of Amiens. We can see that in the interior space we have quadripartite rib vaulting, or 4 ribs that come together into one, a traditional French Gothic design, culminating in pointed arches in a tripartite division here from the nave, the side aisles, the triforium, and the clerestory. The verticality is also continued in the flying buttressing on the exterior. The sensation that is, of course, created here is one of lofty transparency, whereby we are concealing the structural components, just like at Notre Dame, to where we cannot see how the structure actually supports itself. Turning now to Aachen, the capital of Charlemagne here, where his Palatine Chapel is located, we have in the same sphere of influence as Cologne, and also the same regional adoption and adaptation of the French Gothic. Here we find that the Palatine Chapel is remodeled with a new choir added to this Romanesque structure seen here in the center. This is the site for imperial coronations and also the remains of Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor. Thus, it is not surprising that the structure is modeled on Sainte-Chapelle, as it holds also the relics for Christ's crucifixion. Now we have the relics of Charlemagne. Now we have floor-to-ceiling elongated stained glass windows that are very much like that at Sainte-Chapelle, this holy chapel. Now for the Palatine Chapel, the one for the ruler. Charles IV of Bohemia, at the same time, not surprisingly and appropriately for something modeled on the Palatine Chapel modeled on Sainte-Chapelle, is going to donate a bust promoting Charlemagne's canonization to become a saint himself. Here we have the Holy Roman Empire and the Hohenstaufen eagles, that being the ruling family in Germany from the Holy Roman Emperor and their family, is going to be combined with the fleur-de-lis, that being the ruling symbol of the Franks and of France. The Holy Roman Emperors, in fact, ruled both France and Germany. Therefore, both of these symbols would be appropriate at this time. Now, this is also a body part reliquary that is designed to communicate what relic is contained within by what shape and what body part is going to be represented. Thus, we find here the head reliquary is going to be quite popular in the Romanesque, and it should be remembered that skulls and heads were the most powerful of relics. Of any part of the body, the head held the most power. Here we are affirming the legitimacy and authority of the Holy Roman Emperor. If we're able to get the first Holy Roman Emperor canonized, one's authority would be unquestioned. Turning now to Marburg, Germany, we have another very important church and another very interesting and perhaps even more appropriately Germanic expression of Gothic art.
As in England, we find that, here in Marburg, the regional adaptation of the French Gothic can be seen. That is not going to take all of the characteristics the French appreciate, but instead adopt that which they find to be appropriate. Now, at this time, we have an increasing importance placed on sermons in Germany, given their distance from the papacy. And so we develop a particular type of church that is unique to Germany, known as a hall church, or Hallenkirche. This particular hall church, that of St. Elizabeth of Hungary, is going to be the first true Gothic hall church, which would afterwards be widely adopted throughout Germany. Now, St. Elizabeth was a Hungarian princess who married the ruler of Thuringia. However, he died of the plague. Therefore, she set herself to caring for the sick, especially incurable diseases, from that point onward. She was so beloved that the Knight of the Teutonic Order is going to build a church that serves as her mausoleum and a center of pilgrimage for her, and that's what the church we see before us here today is. The Knights Templar were one of the many orders that went to Jerusalem on crusade. The Teutonic Order were like the Knights Templar, that instead came back to Germany from Jerusalem, whose black cross is the basis for the German cross we see on military arms and armament throughout the 20th century. If we are to compare the facade of the Church of St. Elizabeth with a Gothic example in France, such as Rheims Cathedral, we notice immediately how Spartan, how pared down and grave the St. Elizabeth Germanic Hall Church appears by comparison. We find that we do not have nearly as much encrusted sculptural nor sculptural decoration. Instead, this hall church appears much more akin to the Westwerk designed by and for Charlemagne in the Carolingian area and carried on elsewhere in Germany. It is seen as distinctly Germanic, hence it is strong, heavy, and weighty, with these two towers and clear masonry construction supporting it. This robust quality from Romanesque and Carolingian architecture was also appreciated by the English, though they are going to have many more areas dedicated to stained glass, specifically the lancet window designs. The plan for St. Elizabeth is also very distinct from its French counterparts, such as that of Reims at Notre Dame. Here we find that the plan is a German trefoil or three-lobe design, where the choir and transepts are equal distance and size, and are repeated. This motif will be carried on in many different areas associated politically with Germany. In the plan for a hall church, we notice that the nave and side aisles are going to be the same length, that they're going to represent a floor plan that is going to be light-filled and open, with an interior specifically designed to accommodate crowds for sermons, not necessarily for mass or processions. This design is distinct from the French, who are going to emphasize verticality, looking upwards, drawing your eye that direction. Instead, now we're pulled forward, much more akin to the English Gothic designs in churches, such as Salisbury, where we find that the groin vaulting is going to have lancet instead of rose windows, again more akin to the English. So the Germans will associate themselves, not surprisingly, with the English and their counterparts because of the dissimilarity they wish to display politically and stylistically from their rivals, the French. Turning to the Cathedral of Magdeburg, otherwise known as the Cathedral of Saints Catherine and Maurice, we have a great example of German realism that is very distinct from what is seen in France at the time. Here we have the relics of Saint Maurice, an Egyptian African commander in the Roman army who was martyred in 286 with his Christian battalion while stationed in Germany. So that is how this Egyptian made his way and his relics to this German church. Now, Saint Maurice, because he is going to be African, is shown here for the first time as a black African. Now, this is a great example of the German Gothic, for the sculpture associated with German art is going to be defined by its interest in realism. So here we have sculpture that is carved not after a classical statue, not after another work of art, but instead an individual who lived at the time. And so we get a greater psychological presence and sense of realism associated with it. So again, this is the first example of Maurice as a black African because he had Egyptian origins, which is of course quite significant if you look over the history of Western Europe and its art. Because the Germans are the only ones, that being these northern artists, who depict ethnographic specifics among European nations. Here we have an example later on of Matthias Grunwald and the meeting of St. Erasmus and Maurice. Now, the interest in ethnographic specificity is actually going to be a Roman bequeathment to the Germans, for they are going to also appreciate recording the specific clothing, markers, and facial features of the peoples they conquer. Now, unlike Saint Theodore, which is a great example of a military saint in France, we have the same level of detail in the chainmail and the riveted leather. However, we do not have the classical contrapposto or shifting of weight with Saint Maurice. Instead, he stands upright, equally distributing his weight to both legs. In addition, we note that Saint Theodore is based on a French type, even though this saint would have lived and died in different countries. We find that Saint Theodore is shown as a French aristocrat with long curly hair, clean shaven, with French features. Therefore, most cultures are going to show their heroes, saints, or gods in the same way they would show themselves, either as white, black, as once again a particular ethnicity. We view once again the world through our own eyes.
Given that most mercenaries and soldiers come from Germany at this time, we see here something that would invite comparisons with the Moors who they would come in contact with and fight against. Therefore, this becomes a very popular saint among the Crusaders who are heading south to North Africa in the Middle East.
Now, at Naumburg Cathedral, we have another example of this type of specificity and realism in a series of polychromed sculptures, much like that of Maurice, but in this case, imitating those found in Sainte-Chapelle. So very self-consciously, the Germans are going to model a lot of their work in competition with the French. In this instance, Louis IX's commissioning of apostles that decorate the wall piers down below on low consoles in Sainte-Chapelle. Now, in competition with them, we have a series of sculptures that are going to be designed to seem in the same way and, of course, presented on the same pedestals, and also polychromed, but not of apostles. Instead, they're going to illustrate burial chapels and the families that owned these various areas to bury their relatives. Here we have a very well-preserved example of this Germanic Gothic sculpture that is polychromed or painted to look as lifelike as possible, with Eckhart und Uta. Now, the portrait-like couple here is produced for a family burial chapel, and they are life-size. They include 12 ancestors on pedestals at window level, again meant to relate to the 12 apostles at Sainte-Chapelle. Now, these two individuals are not going to be portraits of the original individuals they represent, for they had been dead since the 2nd century. But the best way to record the likeness for a family would be to use live models. Therefore, these are the ancestors of the original Eckhart and Uta in the Naumburg Cathedral. The figures can be compared to the visitation group at Reims, in that they represent an excellent French Gothic courtly approach to the drapery that rhythmically is going to sweep side to side as they are in S-shaped poses. Eckhart and Uta, on the other hand, have a very subtle contrapposto and are dressed in wool garments, which almost everyone would be wearing at the time. Hence, it is more naturalistic and observed, for this is what contemporaries would be wearing. In addition to the posing and the visitation figures, we have an alternative anecdotal interest with Eckhart and Uta, for we find not only is his portly face and his double chin reminiscent of someone's actual features, but we find he also lifts up the strap on his shield with his right hand as it is pinching him to adjust it. We find that Uta as well is going to be polychromed, and unlike the French examples at Sainte-Chapelle, she pulls the drapery, her cloak, over her face as though she is cold, as it would be in these churches, these very drafty churches. Therefore, we have carefully observed anecdotal details that go along with the carefully observed physiognomy of this German couple. This interest forms the basis for German Renaissance naturalism to come in the following centuries, and championed by artists like Albrecht Dürer, who is going to become the Leonardo of the North. This horrific series of events that left millions dead in Europe had a particular effect in Germany that appreciated and prized naturalism and psychological realism. So this is why, thanks to these plagues and widespread famine, that we have the development of Andachtbilder. Andachtbilder are going to be devotional images dedicated to the early or the last hours of Christ's life, usually corresponding with the prayers one would say at different times of the day. Now, this is going to be appropriately and specifically German in that we do not see anything akin to an Andachtbilder in any other country in this period. So you find the Germans are going to focus on this brutal realism that's trying to communicate empathetically the suffering and death that they see around.
It is important to note that mysticism flourished in Germany and the Rhineland, and we see that representations are going to be highly influenced by this practice. In this instance, an Andachtbilder, or devotional image, is often going to be taken up or emphasizing a poignant moment with major characters that are isolated to encourage empathy with them. Thus, we find there is an abbreviated manner to these narratives, such as the Plague Crucifix, or Pestkreuz, from 1304, this one in Cologne. In it, we see with this Pestkreuz an image of an emaciated Christ with his bones protruding, his rib cage poking out, covered in lacerations and blood. Very different and much more graphic compared to earlier versions of the crucifixion, even though Christ would obviously be in a poor condition if he had been beaten and then forced to drag the cross to Golgotha. He would look much more like the Germanic version. So in it, we can see that a sculptural version, much like the Gero crucifix, emphasizes the physical aspects of the crucifixion, the suffering that Christ would have endured, and the twisted nature of his corpse in this instance, that would, of course, brought about empathy and, once again, a type of spiritual solace in the viewer. This is a painful type of proximity that one has with these skeletal contortions, these festering limbs that we have here of Christ, emphasizing the brutality of his death like never before. Only later in such paintings that we have, like Matthias Grunwald's Isenheim altarpiece, and only in Germany do we have such an emphasis on the physicality of death and on the tortured nature of Christ's body. We can see other examples will be carried on later with other such Pestkreuzes here in Germany, as seen in this example.
Time. So this gives rise to a certain type of Andachtsbilder. Bild is an image, for instance, in German, and that's going to be the Vesper build. So Vespers is going to be a prayer that you say in the evening that recalls Christ's death. So here we find with the Virgin and Dead Christ with the Röntgenpietà, a great example of this type of specific Andachtsbilder, the Vesper build, whereby we have a lamentation type with the Virgin Mary seated on an altar with the dead Christ on her lap. She is going to be wearing not her usual blue cloak, but instead a cope, an ecclesiastical vestment, right, that priests wear, that bishops wear at the time, which of course are going to represent the altar on which Christ's body will come back for the Eucharist. But this image is going to be 34 inches high, so once again just under 3 feet, and is not the massive sculptural ensemble you're used to seeing in later periods. So if we look at a detail of the Virgin Mary and Christ, you can see that the image is polychromed or painted in many colors to make it as realistic as possible, from the flesh of her face, the rosy cheeks, the red lips, to the blood pouring out of the grotesque wound in Christ. Right, so this looks like an altar because you find it's appropriate, as this is an altarpiece sitting on an altar, but we are equating the tomb with the throne here. Now, priests are going to pray over the Eucharist, as you see here. Thus, Christ's body comes back, which was sacrificed for Christian salvation. So they are literally viewing the transubstantiation here as they will consume the body of Christ. And you see this is a lamentation type, right, where the Virgin Mary is lamenting her dead child that's going to be curled in her lap. The antitype of the enthroned Madonna and child as we know it. But again, with the Italians, they appreciate idealism. This is rhetorical sadness, as we discussed with these affetti. For the Germans, they appreciate the brutal realism of what it would look like if a body had been crucified and broken, with the nails inserted into the hands and feet, a spear thrust into his side, a crown of thorns lacerating his forehead with blood trickling down. They are not, of course, in any way overlooking the horrific suffering associated with this type of sacrifice. And what do we see but a reflection of what is happening around them every day? They can see the suffering out in the streets with bodies that are strewn about. So many bodies, people could not even bury them. They couldn't even haul them off. So they would put them in piles and burn them, right? So they're seeing this type of suffering happen. Now, the devotional object, which is interesting here, foretells the function of the icon in the Byzantine tradition, in which you pray directly to the Madonna and child. In this instance, we pray directly to the Madonna, so she will intercede on our behalf in the Last Judgment. But it is a personal, private contemplation. Thus, this foretells the schism that will lead to the Reformation. In Germany, the home of the Reformation and Martin Luther, that separates from the Catholic Church, demands a personal relationship and understanding of the Bible and of the holy figures. So this merely foretells that particular approach to worship and religion.
Turning now to the secular world, we find that in Germany, this love of mysticism is going to be carried on from the secular to the religious. Here we have manuscripts also illustrating courtly love, such as the lady here embracing the poet Conrad. Here a falcon is going to be lured by red meat, as the lady also feeds on this man's heart. The woman is above, and she is more active. Thus the man arranges his own undoing by way of this beautiful maiden. In the same way as the previous box, whereby the woman is in control here, who once again binds the man with this around his neck. Thus also the bird, a representation of the love and the passion that's going to be felt by the lovers. The same can be said in religious illustrations, such as the mystical kiss here. Now, mystical love is shown in Germany to be as sensuous as courtly love. In this instance, we have the Sponsa Christi, or the Bride of Christ, whereby the Virgin Mary presses her cheek close to Christ, much like she did when he was a child with the Virgin Eloisa. Now, this is the prelude to the mystical kiss, which has, once again, as the Sponsa Christi, the Bride of Christ, this type of physical aspect of love for Christ. Here we have the adult version, whereby the grown Mother of God, he shown after his death, already with the wounds in his hands, thus a spiritual reimagining of them together, not a physical one, as she presses against him in this gesture of affection. So if we look at the physical understanding of spiritual interactions and courtly love, we see that the very physical and literal interpretation is now carried over to a spiritual example. We see the same thing with Saint Hedwig here of Silesia, holding devotional objects, whereby a prayer book, prayer beads, an ivory sculpture of the Madonna and Child, all are held by this saint. Here the donor portraits below with Ludwig I and his wife Agnes are going to show them in devotion to the Virgin Mary. The graceful elongation is quite common here of the late Gothic, especially the French variation of the late Gothic. It was said that even after death, the corpse of the saint, once reduced to a skeleton, continued to clutch onto this devotional image, gripping it with the fingers that did not decay, just like the sculpture and the object of veneration became a relic. So therefore we find that these saintly figures are going to have this quality called incorruptibility, whereby bodies did not always decompose. Thus, if they avoided decomposition, they showed definitively how holy a figure they were. Such is going to be the case in Germany, that emphasize this type of corporal attribute to spirituality. Thus, next time we will have our final review and our final exam. So prepare for that by making your flashcards.